Okay. This is the sixth session. We have two more to go, B'ezras Hashem. There's obviously a lot of topics to cover, a lot of information. Hopefully you have the book, you read the book. It would have been nice to have devoted one session to each of the 36 sessions, but that's it's most of the year. And we have Purim and Pesach coming up as B'ezras Hashem, so we'll have redemption very shortly as well, God willing. We spoke about Tohu, Torah, Pardes, Tikkun. We didn't actually speak so much about Siruf Libun, a very important concept, which basically means refinement and whitening. There are basically two ways to rectify oneself and to rectify the world, which we do by rectifying ourselves. And the first one, of course, is Torah and mitzvahs and ma'asim tovim, same idea. By learning Torah and by doing mitzvahs with kavanah and davening and working on ourselves, tikkun amidos. So we draw down light from Shemayim. The more light we draw down into the world, the more the world is improved, it's enhanced, evil gets pushed away, like will be in Yemos and Mashiach. Do that sufficiently, then there's no need to have any suffering in the world whatsoever. As the Gemara points out in Sanhedrin, that there are two ways for Mashiach to come. One is Achishana, one is Be'ita. Achishana means early, and Be'ita means the last possible moment. Any moment in time can be early, going back to the beginning. Adam Marishon was supposed to be Mashiach. Adam stands for Adam, David, and Mashiach. And Adam should have been all of that, and he wasn't, and David Melech should have been that, but unfortunately the generation wasn't ready for that. Avraham could have been Mashiach at the Akedah had taken place the way it was supposed to, but the world wasn't ready for that, etc., etc., all through history. Mordechai, Esther, there's always a potential for Mashiach to come in every generation, which is why one of the 13 principles is that we wait for him every single day. Even though he shall tarry, we shall wait. Then is Bita. Bita is the last possible moment that history can allow, based upon the divine timeline that Hashem has set up from the beginning of time. And the difference is, the Gemara says, that if Mashiach comes early, it's going to be because of the schuyot, the merits of Klal Yisrael, that we have drawn down enough light, that we have done it, learned enough Torah, done enough mitzvahs, and as a result of that, the entire world is elevated and made holier. And as a result of that, we're zeichet to bring God in the world, and the words of the prophet, that on that day God will be king over the entire world. Zechariah 14:9, part of Elenu, and everybody will acknowledge him, and his name will be one. That's the goal, and that's what we're supposed to do through Torah mitzvahs. And if we do that, it says Mashiach comes riding on the clouds of Shemayim, of heaven, meaning that everything happens, transitions very nice, the way we'd like it to see it happen, with smiles and everyone, no suffering, and just nice and perfect. The picture, the postcard picture, whatever is the perfect version of Bias Mashiach, the arrival of Mashiach. If we don't do it early, then there's a last possible time, Bita, in which case the Gemara says the Mashiach comes lowly riding on a donkey, which is just a metaphor for that it's not going to happen in a pleasant way. I mean, some say the donkey refers to the Arabs because they're compared to the donkey in Mitzrayim. It says that the Maharal says that it represents them because why? Because the word chamor is chomer, which means materialism. In Mitzrayim, Egypt was the most materialistic society in its time, and others came after that. But so that's the concept of chomer, of chomrius, of physicality. But for the most part, it means basically that it's not going to come in a pleasant way, which usually means the war of Gog and Magog. There are 3 such wars. 2 apparently have occurred, according to everybody. The Chafetz Chaim said the First World War was the first war of Gog and Magog, and the Second World War he predicted would be the second war of Gog and Magog, and the third one, he said, whenever it's going to come, whatever time in history is going to take place, and now it's still hanging over our heads. And the reason for that is because we have to finish. It's not just because the world falls apart, not just as a punishment. It's because we're here to accomplish a certain mission, very specific mission. Each of us have a chelik in it. Not so much the Gentile world, but the Torah world specifically, obviously, which is the whole Jewish people is supposed to be the Torah world. So the more people who are living by Torah and living by Torah properly, the more people are involved in the process of tikkun, of rectification. And that's the goal. That's the whole thing. The whole idea is that we elevate the world. We get rid of the klipos, the impurities in creation, make everything kodesh to Hashem, holy to Kodesh Baruch Hu, and then the world is rectified. Whatever is left over, then basically that's what the war of Gog and Magog comes to rectify, comes to fix up. However severe it is depends upon where history is holding. I compare it to a kablan, a contractor who has to build us a condominium. Right, he's got 2 years to build the condominium, signs people up. They begin selling it in the sales office early before they even start digging into the ground, and people sign. And they sell their houses based upon the commitment that the builder has to provide them with their new home by a specific date. And if everything goes according to schedule, and there usually is a very strict schedule of construction, then everything finishes on time, more or less, and everybody's happy. But sometimes there are strikes. Sometimes weather's an issue. Sometimes there could be shortages of supplies. It could be a number of reasons why construction can become slowed down. And once upon a time, that just meant that the buyers were out. But then eventually they made laws, and people get sued, and there's all kinds of conditions built into the contract. The bottom line is the builder has to try to finish on time for his own benefit as well as the benefit of the people who he's building for. Not just, his reputation is on the line as well. People have sold their houses and they have to move out, and they don't want to move into another apartment or some other house in the meantime. So what happens? All of a sudden he finds himself 6 weeks behind schedule. So, he cannot continue at the same pace that he's been building until now, because that's not going to work. So first of all, they start working extra shifts, maybe even hires extra workers, a whole extra crew to speed the process up. It becomes very intense. There's no time to play, no time to rest. And it becomes difficult, just like preparing for Shabbos, right? All of a sudden you get a phone call 3-4 hours before Shabbos. Can you take, 25 extra guests? It actually happened once to us a long time ago on Erev Shabbos when we were living in the old city, that all of a sudden someone needed to make a Sheva brachas on Shabbos and want to know if we could somehow host it or, in part, and you become frantic all of a sudden because there's so little time, and Shabbos is Shabbos. It's not like Shabbos says, normally you have to stop by sundown, but since you're so behind schedule, keep going. No, once the sun goes down, even 5 minutes before, technically, if not more, you have to stop doing malacha. So all of a sudden it turns out that you don't have enough cakes, or you're making cakes, but they're not baking fast enough. You turn up the heat, it becomes more pressure, more tense, right? That's why it's important, especially on these short days. Rav spoke about this in the shul a few weeks ago, about preparing, things on Wednesday and Thursday, because it's not meant to be a stressful experience. For some reason, we have this idea that it's not Shabbos unless it's stressful the last 2-3 hours before Shabbos comes in. You haven't done enough. No, do enough, but do it in a way that you can finish early enough that there's no stress, because Shabbos should come in peacefully. So unfortunately, it doesn't always work out that way for whatever reasons, especially in Chutz La'aretz, where people have to work on Fridays often much later than they do in Eretz Yisrael, if at all. And as a result of that, there's a lot of stress because of the fact it's so late. So the same thing is true of the war of Gog and Magog. If the war of Gog and Magog has to happen, it's because of the fact that our mission is too incomplete. An example of this is the Holocaust. As many have pointed out, Eretz Yisrael was built on the ashes of the Holocaust. It doesn't just mean that one followed the other, but technically speaking, Kabbalistically speaking, they're not random. These don't happen randomly. They happen because there's a certain time frame by which certain things have to happen. What the Gemara calls ketzim, calls endpoints, either partial redemptions or complete redemptions. But something has to happen by a very specific date. And if the Jewish people are on schedule, everything transitions quite normally, very nicely. If not, then history has to make up what's missing. So it seems, looking back now, that 1948 was the time for the Jewish people to get back the land of Eretz Yisrael. But it's not such a simple thing. Clearly, we see that. Look at all the opposition that we had to getting back the state and keeping it, even until this very day, if not even more so today. And as a result of that, we have to earn it, and we do that by rectifying history, rectifying creation. And if we're behind schedule, then history has to be rectified through us. The tikkun can either happen because of us or through us. Because of us means that we're doing what has to be done. Through us means that we're not, and therefore we have to go through what's called tziruf v'libun, two Kabbalistic terms that mean refinement and whitening, right? So the word tziruf can also mean to attach something or to join something together, because that's what tziruf actually does. The classic example is in halacha on Shabbos, for example. You're not supposed to put a brand new pot on something very, very hot on Shabbos, even though it's empty. Because today, not so much because of the way we make pots, it's much more of a complete process. But in the old days, when they made metal pots, so the more you used it, the stronger it got. Because as you heated it up, the molecules came closer to one another, and it made it stronger. So if you used the pot once before, and it's now basically been hardened as much as it's going to get hardened for the most part. So then it's okay to use it on Shabbos, a brand new pot on the heat. At least in the old days, even today the halacha still stands, I believe. But if you put on the fire, cause it to be let's a ref to join together to become more connected together. So it's a refinement process that we go through. And the second word is libu, which means whitening, from the word lavan, right? So these are things that happen to us because we have not done enough of that on our own. The world around us is so distracting. There's so much going on. I mean, just so much. I mean, and the media covers it, and it's discussions amongst us and our family and our friends, and it's all over the place. We need to worry about wearing masks and vaccinations, that's the real event. That's the real stage that history is being acted out on. Except it's not. The Arizal says at the beginning of Shar HaGilgul, I mean, you don't even need Kabbalah for this. This is to be pashut. It's obvious according to Torah that we are here for one reason and one reason only: Tikkun HaMidos. We've reincarnated so many times already, more than likely. No one's here for the first time. We have been coming back over and over and over again to rectify the traits that we have left unrectified. The parts that have been rectified, they stay in Shemayim. They don't come back the next time. We keep coming back only to rectify that which is left over. And whatever is left over, once history comes to a close, then we go to Gehenna for that. The Jewish version of purgatory, to fix up and to rectify whatever is left over. Rabbi Kiva says in Osis to Rabbi Kiva that everybody goes to the world. Every Jew goes to the world to come. Whether they have a portion or not is another story, but every Jew goes to the world to come. Even the biggest Rishoyim of history will go to the world to come. The only question is, will you have to go to Gehenna first? How long will you have to go to Gehenna, and how deep inside of it? Because there's 7 levels, right? The elevator goes down, 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 4th floor, this 5th floor, and that depends upon how much of a rectification a person was able to accomplish in their lifetime. And rectification is relative to the person, because a person has a certain type of soul, then they might have very little to rectify. A person has another type of soul may have a ton to rectify. For one person, stealing 25 cents may be considered evil. For another person, stealing only $500 as opposed to $1,000 might be considered righteousness from God's perspective, because of the challenge that this person has to face, just to be as good as they are. But that's what it's about. The real stage of life is Tikkun HaMidos, the rectification of our character traits, the refinement of our character traits. Everything else happening in life, whether it's marriage, whether it's raising children, whether it's going to work, whether it's having to deal with doctors and other professionals, or to drive a car or go down, doesn't make a difference. Whatever else is going on in life is only to act as an opportunity to refine ourselves. And that's important to keep in mind, because the Sitra Achra throws all of this at us to distract us away from the main event. It's like going to a movie, sitting in the theater, watching the movie and becoming so absorbed in the plot that you forget you're in the audience. It's as if you're in the movie itself. And the trauma that they're going through is your trauma too. You forget that you went to be entertained. You're not being entertained. You're terrified. You're scared. And you're sad and depressed. Sometimes you walk out. It takes hours to debrief yourself, to go back to being happy. Wait a second, I'm not depressed. He was depressed. Why am I depressed? And you have to get your emotions back online. The same thing is true. The rest of the world, that's their world. The non-Jewish world, the non-Torah world, right? People who are not involved, that's their world. That's all they know. That's all they see. That's all they relate to. But if you learn Torah and you perform it so that you believe in Kadosh Baruch Hu, and you believe in the world to come, and you believe in Gehenna, then there's only one thing for us to do, one thing to be involved with. Tikkun HaMidos. So you have to step back and look at it from a distance and say, okay, whatever's going on, how can I use this thing to improve myself spiritually? That's the only question that we have. That's all that concerns us. And the reason why it's so important is because basically that's how we are able to rise above the rest of the world and be safer as a result of it. Because as the Ramchal points out, the whole reason we're here, really ultimately, why Tikkun HaMidos is so important, is because we want to go to the world to come. And going to the world to come means being close to God. And the Ramchal explains that you cannot be close to God unless you're like God. When it comes to God, opposites do not attract. That's for sure. I don't know how much is true in life either, but certainly when it comes to Kadosh Baruch Hu and HaShavua, opposites do not attract. You have to be like Him. And being like Him means being godly. And being godly means Tikkun HaMidos. And that's life. And the Sitra Achra, he knows that. Right? The Satan or Amalek, Malach HaMavos, whatever you want to call it, it's all the same thing. The Klipos, right? There's lots and lots of names, but they're all basically the same thing. They're here to fool us, to distract us, to make us look over there instead of over here, where we're supposed to be looking, to work on ourselves and fix ourselves up. And there's not much time to do that, because at this point in time, right, there's only 6,000 years to history. We're now holding in the year 5782. That does not leave a lot of time left, as we'll talk about later on, God willing, in the last session, second last session, that there's different stages of history, but it all comes down to 6,000 years. And a person can say, well, 6,000 years, there's still 200 some odd years left to go before. No, it doesn't work that way, because it's Techiyas HaMeisim, the resurrection of the dead, and that's the bulk of the next 200 some odd years. That's the bulk. If 210 according to Rabbi Yehuda and 214 according to Rabbi Yitzchak. That's the Techiyas HaMeisim. The Techiyas HaMeisim, there's no Tikkun HaMidos anymore. There's no free will. There's no Bechira. There's not even Mashiach. Mashiach will be here, but not to do anything, because the world will already be rectified and just get better and better. It's actually an initial stage of the world to come in this world, because it transforms us back to Adam HaRishon's reality, where he was more spiritual than physical, in preparation to go to the world to come. So that leaves very little time left to rectify. I mean, there's really no time for anyone to, unless a person, God forbid, were to die today and be born tomorrow, right? There's little time at all. If a person lives out the next 6 to 8 years, according to this cheshbon, right, they don't die before then, and there's no time for any more gilgulim. So whatever, when the clock strikes 12, when the music stops, and we run for the chairs, so to speak, that's what you are. Whatever's left over, that's for Gehenna. That's the only place after that we can finally go through the final stages of our rectification process. So 6,000, is that definite? Is that just a number? Is it based upon anything? The Rambam seemed to hold that it wasn't absolute, even though the Gemara itself speaks about it in absolute terms, and nobody argues with it. But then again, the Gemara was written by Mekubalim. right? Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and they knew, and they passed down to us, to the generations, that the 6,000 years is absolute because it's based upon the 6 days of creation, which are based upon the six spheres of Chesed through Yesod, which is a discussion to itself. You understand Kabbalah, but that's the cosmic DNA of really the spiritual DNA of all of existence, all of creation, and each of the Sfirot of Chesed, Givur, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, they're all fixed values. They're all fixed realities. They have a certain amount of potential, and that's it. When they finish, they're finished. There's a reason why 3,000 did not become go into 4,000 and be more than 1,000 years. At 3,000, it ended with 4,000, and at 4,000, the Sphira of Hod took over, and at 5,000, the Sphira of Yesod took over. And at 6,000, the sphere of Malchus would take over because everything starts to shift around as the world to come begins. It's all very fixed. So, 5782. Not much time left. What about the fact that some people say, well, how do we know this is actually 5782? Maybe that we're off. Why? Because in the Gentile world, they have Cyrus at a certain time, and we have Cyrus such as Koresh at a certain time, and there seems to be a discrepancy of 160 some odd years. So Art Scroll actually addressed the issue at the back of one of their history books, but the reality is that it's not even an issue for us. First of all, when the Jewish people were taken out of Mitzrayim, Hashem told us exactly what time it was on the clock, and then said, from this point onward, you're responsible to keep track of history. You're responsible to keep track of time. And we've been doing it ever since. We go every month, we take a look at the moon, and we fix the month. We had a base of Mikdash, they were Shemitah. Time matters to us. If you go back to the time of the Egyptians, when Pesach took place, and then after that, you have the Persians and you have the Romans, the Romans already with Josephus were starting to pay more attention to the reality, the truth of history. But until that time, emperors thought they would rule forever. They considered themselves to be gods. They rewrote history to satisfy their own reputations and their own version of what history should be like. Accuracy was not important. They lied. Just like the Russians have rewritten parts of history, and the Nazis were in the process of doing the exact same thing. Because that's what dictators do. That's what fascists will do. They'll do things like that. Even in the States right now, they're trying to rewrite history to some degree. They're embarrassed of it. Doesn't satisfy their idea of how it should look. But the Jewish people, if we lie, we believe in God. Even if you don't believe in God, we believe in God. You may, you don't believe, but we do. And because we do, it's serious to us. It's real to us. We're afraid to lie. We're afraid to cheat because we believe we have to answer to Kodesh Baruch Hu because of it. We have Bali Masora. So we've been keeping track the entire time. The Vilna Gaon in his time, they asked the question because he said that everybody's name is in the Torah because the Torah is the blueprint for creation. So by definition, anything that exists in history has to be rooted somewhere in the Torah. So they asked him, okay, so where's your name? So he said, Parashat Kiseitse. In Parashat Kiseitse, it mentions at the end, it's talking about the stones that a mocher, a seller, has to keep in order to sell his products because they used to sell things by weight, without these automatic scales. But stones in the scale and lifts, the whole thing, right? And you have to make sure they're accurate. Otherwise, it's gazela. You're stealing. So therefore, it says you have to have an Evan Shlema. He said Evan Shlema is Aleph ben Shlomo. Aleph ben Shlomo is Eliyahu ben Shlomo. That's me. I'm in there. So they asked him, how come his first name is not spelled out? So he said, because of the fact that they knew that part of my Torah would remain concealed, the Kabbalistic part. So therefore, only part of my name. But that's in Parashat Kiseitse, which, according to the Vilna Gaon, and before him, not just him, even before him, that every one of the Parashiyot corresponds to 100 years in the 6th millennium. But you'll tell me there's 11 Parashiyot. So it says that Nitzavim v'Yelech usually always come together. This year they didn't, but normally they do. And because they do, they count as one parsha. Even the theme runs over from one to the other. So technically speaking, there's only 10 parshiyot, and Parshat Kiseitse corresponded to his century. So it was perfect. His name in the parsha corresponding to his century of life. That's not going to work out if you're 160 years off in your time. And we answer for this whole Korish business. So someone came along and said, a certain Rav, very important Rav actually, came along and said, well, it's not that we lost track of time, but since we know that the date of Mashiach's arrival is buried somewhere in things like Mishnayos and Daniel and all that, so maybe the rabbis decided to throw us off the scent by fudging the dates a bit to change things around, so we wouldn't be able to figure it out, or the wrong people couldn't figure it out. But that was basically shot down. Most of the Rabbanim shot that down, and some even called it a Chil Hashem because it was like kowtowing to the rest of the world. Why do we have to justify our historical timeline to the rest of the world? We've been keeping track of time. We know what the events are. So for all intents and purposes, as far as we are concerned, we are definitely in 5782. There's definitely only between 4 and 8 years left of the Techiyas HaMesim because 6,000 is absolute, and things have to happen according to a specific schedule, according to the Zohar, according to our tradition. That's that. That's the 6,000 years. At the beginning of the 6,000 years, that's the other part of the equation. It goes back, all the way back to the beginning, right? With the Chet Eitzadas Tavara, which unfortunately is one of the most important events to understand. And of course, is one of the events that most people have no understanding of what's actually going on. The Gentile world basically looks at the Chet, the sin of eating from the Eitzadas Tovara, as if Adam and Chava were like two children whose parents said, don't take from that tree, or if you know it's good for you, you won't eat, not without permission, not before supper, right? And of course, once you say don't do something, the Yetzer Hara comes along and says, go ahead and do it. They couldn't control themselves. They were overcome by temptation. The snake, and the way they draw the whole thing, the snake is right from a tree, and talking to Adam and Chava, and they're like getting, expelled from Gan Eden because they, like children, could not control themselves. And that's the way, unfortunately, the way most people look at it. God gave a mitzvah. There was temptation. They couldn't control themselves, and they ate in the Eitzadas Tovara. And we move on, and we leave the story behind, as if it makes no difference. It means nothing more than just that's the way things went wrong from the very beginning. Until you learn Kabbalah, and you find out, first of all, there's questions that have to be answered. For example, right, before Chava even ate from the Eitzadas Tovara, there was no snake in the Garden of Eden. When Hashem first made Gan Eden was on such a high level, so spiritually elevated, that there was no such thing as the Nachash in the garden. And the truth is, the Nachash was never meant to be evil. Even the Gemara itself in Sanhedrin says that the Nachash is meant to be more like a masharish, like a waiter, like a servant, a butler. That was supposed to be his job. He was supposed to be Adam's best friend, so to speak, to help him do whatever he had to rectify the world and serve God. He only became the Nachash because of a series of events. What was the essential chet? Well, you open the Chumash, right? God says to Adam, don't eat. Adam says to Chava, don't touch. The snake says to Chava, you can't touch, or no, you can't eat, or you can't touch or you'll die. He knows the truth. He pushes her into the tree. She does not die from touching. He says, just like you won't die from touching, you won't die from eating. She says, oh, well, now it looks good to eat. Until now, I was afraid of it. But now it's like, it's nechmed adnaim laskil. I've got all these questions, about what my husband said and the whole thing. And it turns out I didn't die like I thought I would die. And now she wants to eat, and she gave to her husband. Doesn't even say to Adam, like Isha. She gave to her husband. Adam's like secondary all of a sudden. Before he was primary, he was Adam, and that was his wife, Chava. And now he's transformed into Isha. He's only her husband, so to speak. He eats, But because your wife takes poison, you take poison too. It's not Romeo and Juliet. Because it's not a situation where it's like you can't go on living because the other you made a mistake. You shouldn't have done. You didn't die by touching. I added that. That was a gezer d'Rabbanan. That was a rabbinical decree, a fence that I made specifically to keep you up from the tree. And look, it didn't even work. You touched, okay, I should explain it to you. That's my problem, but you beat me. Don't include me in your death wish over here. And don't eat. But he eats anyhow. And there was no snake in the Garden of Eden before that. So then how did the whole thing get started in the first place? Where did the snake come from? This is the way Kabbalah explains a series of events. In the beginning, not the beginning, but the beginning of the Chet, Adam HaRishon, all he was interested in, he didn't have a Yetzer Hara, not inside of him, not inside the garden. There was nothing in the garden that could tempt him. The Nachash, the Sitra Achra, was outside the garden, someplace else. But Adam had a cheshbon. He knew he was here to rectify the world. He knew he was here to rectify creation. And he knew the only place that had to be rectified was the Eitz Hadas Tov Hara. Now, there was no evil in the world at this point in time. There was only potential associated with the Eitz Hadas Tov Hara. And he wants to rectify it. And the Leshem explains that when he was created on such a high level. He was like literally almost perfect as people go. He was on such a high level that, as Rashi explains, that the angels thought he was God. When it says it's not good for man to be alone and God makes him a wife, it's not because Adam is lonely. He's not lonely. Well, not completely, not like we can be lonely today. It's because he was one and God was one and the angels thought he was God or a God. So therefore God made Chava to make the point to the whole world that Adam is man, even though he's so spiritually, elevated and he literally is made from light, etc., etc. And Adam looks at himself and says, well, I've got all this capacity. And it's no different, by the way, than Noach, who drinks the wine after he gets off the teva. Another example of a misunderstood story. He's not just getting drunk because, it's been a rough year on the teva. I mean, personally, if I had to take care of animals for a whole year, I also probably would have got drunk. But that's not why he's doing it. He's doing it because she's a whole new world, a brand new world. That's why he takes off his clothes. He goes back to Adam before the Chet, before they had the clothing. And he figures it's a new start. And since the Chet, according to the Gemara, was done with wine, he uses that to go into the world of Tumah to rectify like Adam did, except it wasn't the time. So therefore, it went astray. Nadav and Avihu, Shlomo HaMelech, all these are examples of the exact same thing. People entering into a test without permission from God, trying to bite off literally more than they can chew, or more than creation is prepared to feed them at that time. And Adam, completely l'shem shamayim, no taiva, no temptation at all, simply wants to do the job he was made to do. It was a matter of timing. It was an issue of time. What he tried to do had to be done, but not yet, not this way. So it says that he began altruistically, l'shem shamayim, but he ended up being posheya, negligent, because rather than fix up creation by eliminating the impurity from the world, he became vulnerable to it, and it transformed him. He went from what was called kasonas or with an aleph. Kasonas is like it's like a cloak. It's like a baguette. Or aleph vav reish is light. We look at our fingernails, right? Motzi Shabbos with the candles to remind us that we once had skin that looked like fingernails. It wasn't made from fingernails, because if it was, it would have been very hard to sit down without hearing a lot of cracking going on. Fingernails are brittle. This is what's left over because of his transformation. But it was like translucent, meaning that his skin was like, it was light. He was more spiritual than physical. But he was transformed from kasonas or with an aleph to kasonas or with an ayin. Ayin vav reish means skin, right? A skin doctor is a doctor for or, right? And this is what we got today. This is the result, what we call epidermis. All these 7 layers, right, correspond. They're the result of the chet of the Eitz Hadas. And once you have that, of course, you need clothing now. Before that, when you're made from light, there's no need for clothing. But once we have skin, physical properties, and you can see what a person looks like, so now you need tznius, and that's what Rashi says. This is the beginning of tznius because there was no need for tznius in the beginning. Tznius is only offense when it's a possibility to abuse creation, which Adam did by eating prematurely. So once he did that, that was the primary chet. The primary chet was not Chava listening to the snake and eating from the Eitz Hadas Torah. That was the end of the show. That's the end of the movie. The beginning of the movie is Adam Arishon, L'Shem Shemaim, altruistically, for all the right reasons, trying to eat from the Eitz Hadas Torah, or at least not even eat yet, just to understand it, just to look at it, just to figure it out, to develop a strategy on how to rectify it so it becomes an Eitz Chaim. Because that's what history is about. We're here to transform the Eitz Hadas Torah into an Eitz Chaim, which would have happened if Adam HaRishon had not eaten before Shabbos, but had waited the 3 hours until Shabbos came in. Then Shabbos would have rectified whatever was left over in creation, including him and Chava, which is still part of the story to explain. And that would have perfected everything. It would have transformed the Eitz Hadas Torah into an Eitz Chaim, and then it would have been a mitzvah to eat from the tree at that time. It didn't happen that way, clearly caused the transformation. And as a result of that, the whole world was lowered, became physical. That's when the snake was allowed into the Garden of Eden. It's like the elevator coming down, the door is opening up. As long as the elevator is upstairs on a higher floor, the doors are shut, no one can go in. But the moment the world comes down and the door is open, so now the Nachash can come in. And Kabbalah explains, Zohar explains that once that was possible, so then the Sitra Achra, right, the Satan, went into the snake, and the snake never spoke a word of its own after that. The entire dialogue in the Garden of Eden between Chava and the Nachash is between Chava and the Sitra Achra, except she's talking to the snake. So she's deceived. She doesn't know what's going on. And she's been transformed. But the most significant difference of all of it, the main thing that was transformed with this transformation from Kesonis Or with an Aleph to Kesonis Or with an Ayin, is mankind goes from this most fantastic level of emes v'sheker, true and false, to tov v'ra, to good and evil. Good is great. It's like good. It's like and evil. It's not the ultimate level. We see that because good can be very subjective. The problem today is how subjective good is. There are people fighting for things that we look at like it's completely perverse. It's completely immoral. The world's in a shambles because people think what the Torah calls evil is good, and what we call good, they call it evil. They want to get rid of all those values. That's the problem with Tov V'Ra. Hitler, Yimach Shmo B'Zichro himself, he wrote, right, that the worst thing that could happen to mankind is the opposite of what's going on in the world around us. In the jungle, it's survival of the fittest. Because it's survival of the fittest survive. And that allows the species to continue on. If the weaker elements are allowed to survive, then basically the species will disappear over time. So mankind's no different, he argued. He was a social Darwinist. They were no different. And therefore, it's wrong to give tzedakah. It's wrong to do chesed. If you can make it on your own, you're a hero and you're great. If you can't, you're a loser. And society will get rid of you. And we're not going to help you stay around because if we do, you will weaken the species. And you know who's responsible for that? That's the Jewish people. They brought bris milah into the world. That's what he said. They brought circumcision and conscience. That's what he called it. Circumcision and conscience into the world, and that's destroyed mankind. What? It's like these are like two incredible spiritual commitments. And he found it to be a terrible thing. And he called it good to get rid of the people responsible for that. Probably just a pretext for his own anti-Semitism, but that was his philosophy. And we're all like, how can that be? Cold War existed for how many decades? Because of two variations of Tov Ra. The Russians didn't see themselves as the evil empire that the Americans saw the Russians as. If anything, they were wary of the Americans, because good and evil can be very, very subjective. But not emes v'sheker. That's absolute. And if you don't have absolute emes v'sheker, then you really have nothing at all. You have no direction in life. Because the moment you stop believing in absolute truth, everything in life, by definition, becomes an opinion only. You can argue as much as you want that it's good and it's the best, and it's no. But if you don't believe in absolute truth, some absolute value that you can compare your conclusions to, by definition, whatever you are saying and believing in is an opinion. So you can never say, and an atheist, to people, at Torah, someone would claim to be an atheist or agnostic. So you say to them, well, how do you feel about Hitler? Was he good or evil? A lot of people they all of a sudden they realize they're on shaky ground just by hearing that question, right? They know where it's going. Some people, they can read it and they're like, oh, now what do I say, right? But some people go, well, he's obviously evil. He wanted to kill, even if I don't believe in God, I still believe that's an evil thing to do. So is that evil, or is that just your opinion? There's a difference, You can say that you don't like what he did. You can disagree with what he planned to do, but you can't call it evil. It's no different than your opinion. What's the basis of your opinion versus his opinion? Because you don't like it, because you feel uncomfortable with that? Well, by the way, that probably came from your background of true and false, but that's a different story. You won't admit to that. And people all of a sudden realize it's a problem. It's true. All I can do is I can say I don't like it. I'm opposed to it because I don't like it, but not because it's wrong. And if it's not wrong, then maybe it could be right. I could be wrong. It gets very confusing for people. People will get up and walk out sometimes because they don't want to admit that they're wrong, but they can't deal with the reality of what their attitude and their approach to life, what it dictates in the end. You have to have that absolute truth, that absolute value. And that was the principal thing that was lost. Now, it's not so simple. Why not? Because the Medrash says that Adam HaRishon came to Hashem and said to Hashem, I just came from the base Medrash. I've been learning your Chumash, your Torah, okay? And I got a couple questions, okay? Sure, go ahead. Shoot. And he says, well, I got everything's fine until I get to Parashat Chukas over here. And in Parashat Chukas, it's talking about the halachas of what happens if you dead bodies in the tent. You're the tent. What happens to the kalim, the vessels, the people, spiritual impurity, and all that from death. And that's in your Torah. And Torah was with you for 2,000 years, whatever that means, prior to creation. So if you don't mean to bring death into the world, then why are you talking about in the Torah already before I haven't even eaten from the Eitz Hadas Davarah? He says, clearly you mean to bring death into the world one way or another, and I'm the fall guy. And the Medrash says, what is this like? It's like a man who decides he wants to divorce his wife, and he prepares a get in advance, and he comes home and says to his wife, hi, how you doing? How's your day? All kinds of nice stuff. And he says, would you mind making me a cup of tea? And she goes ahead, makes him a cup of tea, and as she passes the cup of tea, he passes her the get. And she says, what's this? And it's your get. We're getting divorced. Why? What did I do wrong? You made me a warm cup of tea. Wait a second. I just made you the warm cup of tea. And now clearly this was written before you came home. If this was written before you came home, you obviously planned to give it to me, and you were just looking for a pretext to hand it to me. So Adam says, you obviously want death to exist. You obviously expect me to somehow bring it to the world and then blame it on me. And the truth is, in the end, the Medrash says that if Adam had only done that, if he had only disobeyed God and eaten from the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra, and nothing else but that, he did it. He lowered himself down. The worlds will all become more physical. Chava is more physical. There's a snake, Nachash. All that takes place. We'd still be sitting in the Garden of Eden today. God would have fixed up the chet. If Adam had said, "I'm sorry, I blew it, I made a mistake, I thought, but I regret it." Fine. God was already in the process of rectifying the chet of the Yetzer Das Tov Ra. So what happened? Why are we sitting here tonight in our houses outside of the Garden of Eden? Why are we not back there? What changed that whatever God was doing wasn't good enough in the end? Something very, very significant. Interesting enough, almost no one knows about it, but it's the reason we had to leave. The general narrative is that Adam ate, we got punished, we were expelled. No, he ate, we could have stayed. So then what was the change, the moment, what was the factor that changed everything in the end? It's a little bit complicated, right? And, there are details to go into, but the general idea is that when Adam, or at least Chava, and then Adam vis-a-vis Chava, when Chava interacted with the snake in the beginning, he gave over to her something that we call Zuhama. Zuhama basically is an indelible impurity. Sounds like a girl's name? It's not. Zuhama it's tuma, but it's the kind of tuma that you cannot get rid of by simply going to the mikvah. All the mikvah waters in the world, the entire Pacific Ocean, cannot get rid of the Zuhama. The only time we came close to getting rid of the Zuhama was at Mount Sinai. When the Jewish people stood before Kodesh Baruch Hu to receive Torah, it says Hashem spoke the first of the 10 commandments, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, we all dropped dead. Because the light was so powerful, our bodies we died of ecstasy. We just dropped dead. Hashem had to do Techias HaMesim, to resurrect us. He resurrected us once, and he said, Lo Hiye Elokim Acharim, boom, we died again. And how many times can you die before it's like enough? So the Jewish people say, Moshe, we're not yet cut out for this. How about you talk to God? We'll hear from the distance, right? You talk to God directly, because this idea of dying and coming back 10 times, it's a little much. So we didn't. But the Gemara says, Paska Zuhama son. At that time, we lost the Zuhama. Had it not been for the golden calf, we would have lost it completely. But then we got that back again, more or less. Not all of it, but enough that we still have it until this very day. And we will not get rid of it again until Techias HaMesim, the final one. So that was the interaction with the snake, but it had a profound impact on Chava and on Adam HaRishon in the end. Because basically what the result was, that once Adam and Chava procreated in the state that they existed, you have to understand, until that time, there was no intrinsic internal Yetzer Hara. That's what transforms the true and false to the good and evil. It's like taking white paint and adding black, you get gray. Taking the emes, the absolute emes, and adding a Yetzer Hara creates tov, subjectivity. We cannot be objective. We have to have Torah to be able to be as objective as possible. Without Torah, you cannot be objective. It's not possible. Whatever scientists, how much of a genius they are, you can't. Without Torah, there's no basis of objectivity. Because God is that objectivity. So when Adam had no Yetzer Hara, there was no reason to die. Because the whole reason for death is to separate the Yetzer Hara from the person, which happens in the grave. That's why we die. Because the Zuhama is intrinsic to our existence because of the snake. And as a result of that, we have to die to take it apart. But before the Yetzer Hara became a part of man, had the Nachash been in the Garden of Eden, but remained to be the Yetzer Hara external to Adam HaRishon, he would have been rectified or gotten rid of, whatever, and Adam would have been rectified completely. Would all be Gan Eden to this very day. But once they had the Zuhama in them, even though it was not intrinsically a part of them, but it was in them superficially, and then they procreated and gave birth to Cain and a twin sister, and then Hevel and two twin sisters. They were the first ones born with an intrinsic Yetzer Hara. They were a combination of Adam and the Zuhama of the Nachash. Intrinsically, it was built in, partly interwoven, even though one's spiritual, one's physical, but it's interwoven. And once it was interwoven, the only way, more or less, to separate the Yetzer Hara, the Zuhama from a person is through death. And you can't die in the Garden of Eden. It's a place of life. The only place you can die is outside of it. So even though God said, on the day that you eat, you shall surely die, right? It didn't mean in the Garden of Eden. It could have been fixed up. But the events, right? God knew in advance how it's all going to play out. And he meant eventually you're going to die, because you know what's going to happen? You're going to eat, right? And you'll interact, and that will bring the world's, actually first you'll look at the tree, right? You'll get involved with it intellectually. You become unified with it through your mind, because as it says, the mind of the person, the thing being looked at, and the person himself, they all become one. You look at something, you connect to it, right? There's no such thing as looking, glance. If you just happen to glance and not pay attention, right? Then that's fine. It's like it's not even there. You didn't even notice. It does register to some degree, but not that much, not consciously. But the moment wait a second, you take a look at you make a relationship. There's a connection already. So Adam became connected to the tree through his looking. That lowered the worlds, because it lowered him, opened the door to spiritual impurity. The world became more physical. The snake came in. The snake talked to Chava. Chava then talked to Adam, who was no longer on the level of true and false anymore, but the level of good and evil at that stage, unclear, not knowing what to do. It's like today, how many people really know what to do regarding the vaccines and the coronavirus? You got opinions on this side, that side. You got Rabbanim, Gedolim saying this, and Gedolim saying it's such a difficult time. The people that we trusted, the people we believe in, we used to run to and relied upon, all of a sudden are no longer reliable, because we don't know who's telling the truth. There's layers upon layers upon layers. So people decide, or go with this one, go with that one. Very much like what happened at the beginning of history, which is perfect, because we are now in that period that corresponds to that time, which we'll get to in the last session, but the 10th hour, God willing. A lot of overlap, a lot of correlation taking place right now, if you understand what's happening and you step back and look at it from the big picture point of view. But after that, once Cain and Hevel are born, that's when whatever rectification Hashem is doing is no longer good enough, and man has to leave. He has to be expelled. And we leave. And that's the beginning of history as we know it, going back at that time. Now it's a matter of Cain eventually killing his brother outside the Garden of Eden. Shomer Achanochi, the classic question, am I my brother's keeper? Right? And you have generation after generation, forging new lives in the world and trying to make heads and tails of how to survive there, stealing, pillaging, very few tzaddikim, because we no longer have that connection with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. It does say in a sefer called Pirkei Rabbi Yishmael, very short book I once happened to come across, and I don't even know where it is anymore. Wish I had it, but in that very thin sefer, a lot of Kabbalah. And it says in the beginning, after they left the Garden of Eden, the garden was still there. It was like a fenced in, like a fenced in estate, so to speak. You could actually look into it. You could see into Gan Eden. You couldn't go into it, but you could look into it. But as man became more abusive and more disconnected from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, eventually HaKadosh Baruch Hu hid that too. It's here. It's in the world, right? But we're not on the spiritual level to be able to perceive it. But you can experience little aspects of it. The whole drive of mankind for physical pleasure is not just because it's enjoyable, but we were fashioned in Gan Eden. We were fashioned in paradise. That's where we belong. That's the world we're trying to go back to. So there's two ways to do that, right? Either you can work on yourself and reverse the chet last week's Parashat V'yechi, the Gemara says, Yaakov lo meis. The Yaakov didn't die. That's kind of a machlokas, an argument that he actually not die, or it's just being metaphorically. But the Gemara does say in Maseches Kaleb that 7 people actually did not die and went right to Gan Eden without going through death. But isn't death the only way to? No, death is just one of the ways to go. But if you could reverse Zuhama by Tikkun Midos, somehow you wouldn't have to die. So where did you go? Well, you're not going to be visible anymore. Because just like if Adam HaRishon, as he existed prior to the Chet, were to be in this room right now, we wouldn't see him. We wouldn't be able to. Because our vision, our perspective, our assumptions about life would blind us to that level of spiritual perfection. It says that Eliezer, the servant of Avram Avinu, was one of those 7 people. That's quite a stretch. He was righteous at tzaddik, but to such a degree. I mean, it says by Avram that he died, and Yitzchak died, and Yaakov died, or at least we assume Yaakov died. According to the Orach Chaim, that's one of the reasons why that Yosef had him embalmed, even though we don't do things like that, right? We don't cremate, we don't embalm, right? So why would Yosef do a thing like that? Even though they have to go back to his Canaan still, why they went back pretty fast. So the answer is because he knew that Yaakov just disappeared. He just evolved to the next level of reality. But if people knew that, they would have made him into an avodah zarah, into an idol. So therefore, Yosef went through the motions of physically bearing Yaakov because of the fact that he didn't want it to become an avodah zarah after his death. It's very interesting because as he gets to Eretz Canaan, it says that all the nations at that time came out thinking that Egypt was prepared to go to war. Then they saw Yosef and the what do you call it, the bear, with Yaakov. They realized that it was to bear Yaakov Avinu. It says all the kings came and put their crowns on the coffin of Yosef, of Yaakov, whatever they used to carry him, right? The aron that they carried him in, right? How many crowns the Gemara says? 36 crowns. 36 crowns. So either all these kings were Kabbalists, or the Medrash is telling us something, because Baruch Hu arranged it, but they're all 30, they didn't count. Hashem had 36 crowns placed on Yaakov Avinu to tell us what? That he's in the Bechin of the Organuz. Anyhow, we knew, right? His whole life was the Organuz. The Pachim Ketanim, we spoke about by Chanukah time. The Gematria of Leah is 36. Rochel dies at the age of 36. He's away from home for 36 years. When he's injured, the sun shines for him. Which light? Low. Yeah, that's Yaakov. Organuz all the way. So more than likely, Yaakov did not die. He went straight to the next world because he perfected himself. He had 17 years, which they point out is the gematria of the word tov, which is used with respect to the Or HaGenuz, to tell us that Yaakov, that's what he was doing. He was accessing the light and elevating himself till eventually he just moved to a whole different level after saying goodbye. And as Rashi points out, it doesn't say he dies. Just that he gathers his feet together, and then after that, Yosef embalms him. So that's history. That's what we've been working to rectify. And B'ezras Hashem, we'll see how Noach teaches some of the most important lessons about life, and how it's even tied to Hanukkah to a large degree. And then basically we'll have to work our way towards the 10th hour, because I don't know if I can speak fast enough. History is evolving and moving and changing at such a quick rate. I mean, if you understand what you're looking at, the problem is, and this is a very important point, and I'm just in the middle of finishing a book right now about this idea, so it goes into more detail about it. But we're in a paradigm shift. The trouble in 1938 and 1939, and until the Holocaust, we were going through a paradigm shift. David HaMelech said, "Me'ez Hashem haisa zos hinivas beinenu." It's a klal of Jewish history. This is from God, that which is wondrous in our eyes. That's what he says. We said in Hallel, it's part of Tehillim. So the obvious question is, what do you mean? Only that which is wondrous in our eyes is from Hashem? No, everything is from Hashem. If you notice, though, David HaMelech doesn't say Me'ez Elokim haisa zos, Me'ez Hashem Yud Kei Vav Kei haisa zos hinivas beinenu. What's the difference? This week's parsha. Take a look at this week's parsha. right? Paro will say to Moshe Rabbeinu, Mi Hashem, that I should listen to him. Rashi says he doesn't disbelieve in God. He believes in Elohim. But Elohim, as the Gematria suggests, which is equal to the word Ateva, not referring to the pharmaceutical company, but to nature itself, right? That he understood that God runs the world, but he works by Derech Teva. And by Derech Teva, we are the mightiest nation on the face of the earth, and you don't even have an army. So how are you going to go out, and why should I listen to you? So Moshe says, because until now, it's only been Elohim. But we're going through a paradigm shift right now. Me'ez Hashem, David HaMelech says, Yud Kei Vav Kei. Don't start up with Yud Kei Vav Kei. Elohim, it's business as usual. But Avaya, miracles, overt miracles. God stepping into history and doing things that make everyone stand back and say, whoa, what's this? Why is it happening? And what should we do? The headlines are talking about it. That's Meis Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, which means it's no longer Elohim. We're shifting from one to the other as we enter the final stage of history. People have given this type of a shir now for thousands of years, but they could not end up by saying we're entering the final stage of history. We're giving this shir right now, and we can say it. So we need to understand quickly what it is we're supposed to be accomplishing, because there's not much time to implement it. And I don't know if there's enough time to save the whole world, right? That remains to be seen. But certainly, as we learn from the Holocaust itself, miracles still do happen for people, even at dark times like that. And the beginning of that is understanding the big picture and what it is we're supposed to be accomplishing with the time we have to do it in. Okay, have a good night.